There was once a village where the nights never truly ended, and time moved like fog, soft, slow, and shapeless. Nestled at the edge of a forest thick with whispering pines, an old watchmaker lived alone, surrounded by ticking echoes and dreams unspoken. They say he once loved someone who lived in his dreams more than in waking life. So he built something, not a clock to tell time, but one that gently counted down to dreams. It didn't tick seconds. It measured memories. It didn't strike 12. It sighed when you were ready to fall asleep. This is the story of that man and the quiet town that began to drift into deeper sleep each night, lulled not by the wind or the dark, but by the clock he created, a clock that helped them forget the noise of the world and remember the language of dreams. Let the story begin now. You don't need to stay awake for all of it. Just let it wash over you like moonlight through a lace curtain. Whenever you're ready, close your eyes and drift. The village of Elmsworth was the kind of place that faded from maps but stayed in memory. Nestled between two rivers and wrapped in the arms of evergreen trees, it held on to its seasons like secrets. The kind of place where snow fell like powdered sugar and summers carried the scent of baked bread and lavender. And in the heart of that quiet town stood a shop, older than any living soul remembered, marked only by a hanging sign with a single golden gear etched into weather-worn oak. Inside that shop, surrounded by walls of silent clocks and watch faces frozen mid-tick, lived a man named Elliot Meyer. He had thin silver hair that reflected the candlelight like strands of wire, and eyes that seemed always lost, not unfocused, but tuned to a frequency just beyond the world the rest of us could touch. Elliot didn't sell clocks anymore. He hadn't in years. But he still opened his shop every morning, as if by ritual. The townspeople whispered about him, not unkindly, but with a reverence reserved for things you don't quite understand. Children peeked through the shop window, daring each other to catch him in the act of something strange, and sometimes they did. He would place his hand on one of the clocks, not to wind it, not to set the time, but as if to listen. His fingers lingered over gears as if they breathed. He spoke to them sometimes, softly, like you might speak to an old friend you hadn't seen in years. But Elliot was not mad. Or, if he was, it was the kind of madness that comes with loving something invisible. What no one knew was that Elliot was building something that didn't belong to hours or minutes, a device that hummed in his dreams long before it took form in the waking world. A clock, yes, but one that didn't count time. It counted longing. It measured the space between thoughts, between memories, between breath and sleep. And with every gear he fitted into place, something ancient began to stir. Elliot's workshop smelled of oil, old paper, and rain-drenched wood. The scent lingered like memory, soaked deep into the floorboards that creaked under his slow, measured steps. He rarely spoke, but the walls seemed to carry on conversations in the ticking and clicking that filled every corner of the room. The clock, the one he had spent decades dreaming of, rested beneath a large velvet cloth. Only Elliot knew what it looked like beneath the fabric. Not even the occasional curious visitor who stumbled in for a forgotten repair ever caught a glimpse. It wasn't ready, he would say. It's not tuned yet. Tuned, not built. As if this creation were more musical instrument than machine. Each evening, as the sky slipped from amber to navy, Elliot would return from his walk through the fog-lined riverbank and stand before it. He didn't touch it. Not yet. He would stare, as if waiting for the machine to speak first. And slowly, over weeks, the machine began to respond, not with words, but with presence. The space around it changed. Clocks on the wall would slow slightly as he passed them. Candles would flicker despite the absence of wind. Even time in the room seemed to thicken, like syrup in winter. It was built from pieces scavenged across years, a gear from an old lighthouse clock, a spring from a child's music box, a pendulum from a monastery bell tower that hadn't rung in decades. Each piece held a memory, Elliot believed. Each one had counted seconds of someone's life, and he was giving them one last purpose, not to measure time forward, but inward. Sometimes, in the deadest hours of night, Elliot would hear the softest chime, though the machine had no bell. A note so faint it felt like it rang inside his chest rather than the room. He would close his eyes and whisper, "It's almost time." Not for waking, not for endings, but for drifting into the place between. Elmsworth was a town that noticed things slowly, like snow that quietly buried fences, or ivy that silently took over walls. Change was never sudden there. And so, when the nights began to feel different, longer, gentler, heavier somehow, no one could say when exactly it began, only that it had. Children started falling asleep faster. Elderly couples, who usually tossed and turned, spoke of the softest silence wrapping their windows. The blacksmith's wife, who had suffered sleeplessness for 20 years, began dreaming again of her mother's humming, of fireflies over summer rivers. No one connected it to Elliot. Not yet. In the workshop, Elliot continued assembling gears with hands that moved like breath. No instruction manual guided him, just a memory of a voice long gone that once said, "When you dream, time isn't real. Only the feeling is." The voice belonged to her. No one knew her name, not anymore. She had been gone for decades. Some said she had died. Others whispered she had simply drifted away, not from the town, but from this world, like steam into night. Elliot never corrected them. Some truths are too delicate to press against. He remembered her laughter, though. It came back to him in echoes when the gears aligned just right, a fluttering sound that danced on the edge of silence. And when he worked late into the night, the reflection in the glass sometimes shimmered, not with his own image, but hers. That night, Elliot placed the final piece, a small crystal balance wheel, into the core of the clock. It didn't tick. It didn't chime. It exhaled. A long, silent breath. And outside, in the fog-soaked streets of Elmsworth, a thin layer of frost formed on window panes in the shape of swirling spirals, like the inside of watch springs. Somewhere, a child stirred in bed and whispered, "I remember." Remembered what? Not a story, not a place, but a feeling, like falling softly into stars. The morning after Elliot placed the crystal wheel into the heart of the clock, he awoke before dawn to a stillness more complete than he'd ever felt. The air in his home didn't move. The dust in the beams hung frozen. Even the ticking of the other clocks, hundreds of them lining his walls, had stopped. Not broken, just waiting. He rose, barefoot on the cold wooden floor, and lit a single oil lamp. Its flame burned lower than usual, as if respectful. And when he entered the workshop, it wasn't the cold that made him pause. It was the silence, not emptiness, but a silence that had presence, as though someone or something had already arrived before him. The clock stood there, uncovered now. Elliot hadn't removed the velvet cloth, but it was gone, folded neatly in the corner, as though done by invisible hands. The device looked like no clock anyone had ever seen. There were no numbers, no ticking hands, no dial, only a wide, open circle of exposed gears and glass, with faint symbols etched around its rim, constellations, waves, and delicate markings that resembled fingerprints and sleeping eyes. In its center floated a slow-moving spiral of thin silver arms, orbiting each other like they were breathing in time. Elliot stepped closer. As he did, he felt a strange lightness in his limbs, like the sensation you get right before falling asleep. His thoughts slowed, not out of fatigue, but in surrender. The machine was not counting seconds. It was counting readiness. And as he stood before it, the arms aligned into a perfect curve and then stopped. Outside, the sun rose without light. The sky glowed a muted lavender, and for the first time in memory, birds didn't sing. Not because they were gone, but because they, too, were still listening. Listening to the first moment a dream was born in the real world. Elliot whispered, not to the machine, but to the silence. Tonight, we begin. That evening, Elliot did something he hadn't done in years. He opened the door to his shop and left it ajar. A quiet invitation. No sign was posted, no bell was rung. But as twilight spilled down the narrow streets of Elmsworth, a few townspeople paused outside his door. They didn't enter, not yet, but they lingered, glancing in as the glow from inside pulsed like candlelight inside a dream. Through the dusty window, they saw Elliot seated in his usual place, not working, not repairing, just sitting beside the strange new clock. It was turning slowly, not ticking, not chiming, just turning, spirals within spirals, like watching smoke dance inside a glass dome. The baker's daughter was the first to cross the threshold. She was no more than 10 years old, with dark curls and eyes too large for her face. She walked in slowly, her shoes making no sound on the old wooden floor. Elliot looked at her, not surprised, as though he'd been waiting for her specifically. He pointed gently to the stool across from him. She sat. For a long moment, neither spoke. The girl's gaze fixed on the clock, her lips slightly parted. "What is it?" she whispered. Elliot didn't answer right away. He reached beside him and pulled a small lever attached to the base of the device. The moment he did, the room dimmed. Not darkened, but dimmed in feeling, like the hush of a library or the moment before rain. "It's a map," Elliot finally said. The girl tilted her head. "Of where?" "Of in between," he replied. "Between waking and sleeping, between memory and forgetting, between what we were and what we dreamed we'd become." She blinked, trying to understand, but said nothing. She didn't need to. because suddenly her breathing slowed, her shoulders relaxed, and in the reflection of the clock's surface, she didn't see herself anymore. She saw stars drifting above a quiet field, and the outline of someone she used to know. And outside, the night settled deeper. Word of the clock spread not by speech, but by silence. The next night, 2 more visitors arrived. A man who had once been a soldier, and a woman who had not spoken aloud since her brother passed away. They came not because they were told, but because something in the air whispered them forward. A pull like gravity made of longing. Elliot greeted them with the same stillness. He did not explain the machine. He didn't need to. The room itself held the answers, as though each breath they took there translated something ancient, something that bypassed language altogether. They sat across from the clock, shoulders hunched with years they'd carried. Neither expected anything to happen. But as the spiral arms began to turn slowly, a shift occurred, not outside them, but within. The soldier, for the first time in years, thought of the field he used to run through as a child, chasing dragonflies with a wooden sword. The woman heard the sound of her brother's laugh again, not as memory, but as presence, as if he were waiting for her in a place just beyond the horizon of her mind. Their eyes softened, their muscles loosened, and after a time, they rose, nodded silently to Elliot, and left. Neither said a word. Neither had to. That night, the town slept deeper than ever before. Dreams came not as flickers, but as entire landscapes. Some dreamed of trains that rode across stars. Others wandered through libraries made of moonlight. One boy dreamed he was a raindrop falling into the ocean and remembering every cloud he had once been. And at the center of it all, unnoticed yet always present, was the soundless hum of Elliot's clock, turning gently, endlessly, like a compass always pointing toward sleep. By the time the moon reached its peak, no candle burned in Elmsworth. Only the clock remained lit, and only Elliot remained awake, not because he could not sleep, but because he chose to stand watch over the dreaming. Eliot's notebook was filled with symbols, soft loops, mirrored glyphs, constellations that did not belong to any known sky. Each page held a different configuration, and though they looked chaotic to others, to Eliot, they made perfect sense. He wasn't recording time. He was recording entry points, the invisible places where people began to drift from the waking world into something softer. Some entered through sound, a melody half remembered from childhood. Others stepped through memory, the scent of old wood, the creak of stairs, a name long since whispered. Each person had a different passage, and Eliot's machine, it found them. The clock didn't guide people. It listened. And when it heard what someone longed for most, it gently turned the gears that led them inward. One evening, an old man arrived. He had no family, no visitors, and hadn't spoken aloud in over a year. He sat before the clock in silence, hands trembling slightly on his lap. Eliot didn't say a word. The machine began to turn. The man leaned forward, eyes wide. He saw a dock on a quiet lake, the very one where he had proposed to his wife 50 years ago. He saw her bare feet on the wood, her laughter echoing across the water, her hand reaching out for his. Tears slid silently down his cheeks. He left without saying a word, but that night he slept for 12 hours straight, the first full night's sleep in decades. Stories like this were never told, but they rippled across the town like soundless thunder. Children no longer feared the dark. The lonely stopped feeling so alone, and people began to greet each other in the mornings with a softness they hadn't known before. Eliot wrote none of this down. He didn't need to. The machine recorded everything, not in memory chips or ink, but in resonance. The more it helped people sleep, the more it tuned itself to their frequency. It was becoming alive, not like a person, like a lullaby that remembers who it's for. It was on the 9th night that the dream began to ripple outward, not just into those who sat before the clock, but into those who had never stepped foot into Elliot's shop. Sleep became deeper across the entire village. People who had long battled restlessness found themselves drifting off mid-sentence, mid-thought, with a peace they hadn't known since childhood. No one complained. The town's tempo slowed to match its nights. Street lamps stayed on longer, and children began drawing spirals in the dirt without knowing why. The school teacher paused during a lesson on history, gazed out the window, and forgot what year she was teaching. It didn't matter. What was happening wasn't a spell. It was a recalibration. A town syncing itself to the hum of something older than time. The clock, now referred to quietly as the sleeper, no longer required Elliot to turn it on. It spun on its own, softly, continuously. Its spiral arms glowed just faintly now, like the ember at the end of a candle's life. Some nights, Elliot didn't even light the lamp in the shop. He would simply sit beside the machine in darkness, watching its glow move across the floorboards like moonlight through branches. He wasn't waiting for anyone anymore. He was listening to the stories it whispered in return. One evening, as the clock turned, it paused. Just briefly, Elliot noticed. He rose, walked to it, and placed his hand against the glass. It felt warmer than usual, as if it had just returned from somewhere else. Then, for the first time, Elliot heard it. A voice, impossibly soft, curling around his mind like a thread of smoke. "Are you ready?" He closed his eyes, took a breath, and nodded. He wasn't afraid. Not of silence, not of night. He had spent years preparing, not to end time, but to understand its gentlest edges. He had built the clock not to measure life, but to remind people how it feels to let go. The 10th night was colder than usual, though no frost formed. Instead, the streets glistened faintly, as if the dew itself had chosen to shine. Lamps flickered with golden halos, and wind chimes across town swayed in a breeze no one could feel. Inside the shop, The air shimmered with something close to reverence. Elliot lit no candles. The glow of the clock was enough. It bathed the walls in soft spirals of amber and silver, shadows gently turning like thoughts in half-sleep. He sat across from it, the only sound his own breath, slow, steady, perfectly matched to the machine's hum. He placed the notebook on the workbench beside him, but didn't open it. There was nothing left to write, nothing more to track. The machine no longer needed him to document its progress. It had surpassed design. It had become intention. Then the door creaked open. A woman stepped inside, wrapped in a pale blue shawl. Her eyes were tired, not from lack of sleep, but from carrying too many dreams unspoken. Elliot had never seen her before, but he recognized her immediately, not from memory, but from the feeling she brought with her. Unfinished music. He gestured to the chair. She sat, hands clasped in her lap. The clock began to turn. At first, she didn't move. Her gaze remained fixed on the spirals, her shoulders stiff. But slowly, like thawing ice, she began to weep, quietly, not from sadness, but from recognition. She was seeing someone she had long stopped allowing herself to remember. A child, a boy, smiling, running, vanishing into the golden field that only existed now within the folds of the clock. Elliot did not speak. He had no comfort to offer that was greater than what the machine gave. When she finally rose to leave, her face was soaked but soft, lighter, like someone who had finally released a name she'd been holding too tightly. As she stepped outside, the wind finally returned to Elmsworth, carrying with it not the cold, but the distant scent of lavender and lullabies. On the 11th night, the clock began to change. Not in shape, its spirals still turned with that same quiet grace, but in presence. It began to feel less like a machine in a room, and more like a room within a dream. The light it gave off reached farther now, curling around shelves, seeping into floorboards, and settling in the spaces between the seconds. Elliot noticed first. When he reached out to dust its frame, the air around it felt thicker, not oppressive, but weighted, like standing beneath a tree full of unspoken thoughts. He pulled his hand back, not from fear, but respect. Something ancient was waking. That night, when a teenage boy arrived, one known around town for sleepless wandering and angry silences, Elliot said nothing. The boy slouched into the chair, headphones still dangling around his neck, arms crossed. He didn't ask what the clock was. He didn't need to. The machine began its slow, hypnotic turn. At first, the boy scoffed under his breath. But then, his shoulders shifted, his posture softened, his jaw unclenched, his eyes blinked slower and slower until, without realizing it, he leaned forward as though drawn. He saw a room filled with light, not electric, not natural, a glow made of memory, the flicker of a television at night, the warmth of a hand once held, a laugh echoing from a kitchen doorway. Tears didn't come. Not for him, but something inside released, something that had been holding its breath for years. And when the boy stood to leave, he turned to Elliot and said only one thing: "I didn't know I forgot him." Elliot nodded. No explanation was needed, because the clock was never meant to remind you of dreams. It was built to remind you of what still lives beneath your waking mind, the places you buried when the world demanded you be strong. And now, Elmsworth itself was beginning to remember, not what had been lost, but what had only been asleep. The 12th night fell like velvet. Clouds covered the moon, but the town glowed anyway. The light came from within now, from windows where families sat quietly together, from bedrooms where children slept with fingers curled around invisible threads of old dreams. The street lamps seemed dimmer by comparison, as though humbled by the warmth radiating from inside the people themselves. In the workshop, the clock turned without Elliot's touch. Its movement had become as natural as breath, as soft and constant as a heartbeat. The glow inside had deepened, too. Not brighter, just more resonant, like a note held in harmony with something far beyond this world. Elliot stood beside it, watching not the spiral arms, but their reflections in the glass. He'd begun to see patterns in the way they moved, not random, but choreographed, like a dance choreographed by memory and emotion. He no longer needed to ask what it was doing. He knew. It was tuning itself to every soul it encountered, mapping their stories, not in time, but in feeling, the rhythm of a grandmother's lullaby, the exact hue of a father's old jacket, the specific silence that falls between two people who never got to say goodbye. That night, a woman came in holding a box. She didn't introduce herself. She simply walked to the table, set the box beside the clock, and opened it. Inside were pieces of a shattered pocket watch, rusted, worn, and silent. "It was my brother's," she said. "I found it yesterday in a drawer I thought was empty." Elliot looked at the pieces, then at her. She didn't ask him to fix it. She only wanted to leave it there, near the one thing in the world that seemed to understand time in ways no human ever could. He nodded. She left without looking back. The next morning, the watch pieces were gone. Not repaired, not visible, just gone. And in their place, the clock's spiral turned once more, with a slightly different curve, as if it had just inherited another memory and decided to carry it forward. On the 13th night, the fog returned to Elmsworth. Not heavy, not cold, but soft and silver, like a curtain pulled gently across the sky. It curled around rooftops and trees, slow dancing in the narrow alleys. But no one was afraid. The fog no longer felt like something that hid things. It felt like something that protected them. Inside the shop, the clock pulsed in harmony with the fog's rhythm. Its spiral turning more slowly than usual, as if syncing with the breath of the town itself. That evening, Elliot received no visitors. He didn't mind. The clock still turned. He sat in his chair, the wood creaking beneath him like an old friend sighing. He closed his eyes and simply listened. And in that quiet, he began to hear something he hadn't heard in years. Footsteps, not real ones, not outside the door, but inside the silence, like an old memory taking shape again. He opened his eyes. Across from him sat a young woman. She wasn't physically there. She couldn't be. He knew that. She had been gone for years. And yet, she sat there, smiling softly, wearing the blue scarf he had kept folded in the drawer beneath his bed. Her eyes shimmered like the first snowfall. She didn't speak. Neither did he. The clock turned once, slow and deliberate, and with it, Elliot's breathing caught, not in panic, but in wonder. He had built the machine for others, but somehow it had remembered him. It had mapped his longing, stored his sorrow, held on to the one thing he never admitted he still dreamed of, her. And now, in the amber glow of the spiral, for just a moment, Elliot remembered what it felt like to be held by someone who loved him completely. Not in this world, not in any world, but in that sacred, secret place that lives just behind the eyes, where we go when we fall asleep and find someone waiting there. By the 14th night, people had stopped trying to understand the clock. They no longer whispered questions in the marketplace or wondered aloud how it worked. The town had surrendered, not in defeat, but in trust. The same way one trusts the rain to fall or the stars to rise. The clock simply was. Children passed the shop on their way home from school and left drawings by the door. Spirals, stars, softly sleeping faces. A teenager strung tiny bells across the fence one afternoon. By nightfall, they chimed without wind, singing lullabies in a language no one knew, but everyone felt. Inside, Elliot had begun sleeping in the shop, not from exhaustion, from peace. Each night, after the last visitor left, he would curl on the cot in the corner, covered in a quilt older than the town itself, and let the machine hum him into stillness. His dreams no longer felt like dreams. They felt like places he could visit and return from with a soft kind of clarity. He began seeing things. A swing creaking slowly in a forgotten playground. The hush of a cathedral made of books. A feather drifting through a sunbeam that never ended. These weren't memories. They were fragments of other people's dreams. And the clock was sharing them with him. He didn't question why. The why no longer mattered. One night, he dreamed of a girl in a red dress walking across a bridge that floated in the sky. She turned to him and said, "We're all sleepwalkers, Elliot, even when we're awake." When he awoke, the shop smelled faintly of roses and rain, though no windows had been opened, and the spiral arms of the clock had rearranged themselves again, forming a shape he hadn't seen before. It looked like a door made not of wood or metal, but of possibility. The 15th night came with rain, soft and endless, a curtain of silver threads falling gently on rooftops, cobblestones, and windows. But in Elmsworth, no one reached for umbrellas. They simply stood under it, eyes closed, faces turned upward like flowers remembering sunlight. Elliot stood in the doorway of the shop, watching droplets slide down the glass like time itself melting. Behind him, the clock turned slower than ever before, almost as if it were listening, not to sound, but to rhythm. A visitor arrived just before midnight. He was younger than most who came, no more than 20, his clothes soaked, hair clinging to his forehead. He didn't speak, just stood in the doorway, shivering. Elliot offered him a towel and a seat. No questions asked. None were needed. The boy sat before the clock, hands buried in the fabric of his sleeves. His eyes darted between the gears, as if afraid to settle on any one part. His foot tapped uncontrollably, nerves leaking out through movement. But then, the spiral arms began to glow. A dim blue, the color of deep lakes and lullabies. The boy's tapping slowed. He blinked, and in the reflection, he saw himself, not as he was now, but as he used to be, barefoot, laughing, running across a beach at dusk with someone chasing him, a sister, a friend? He couldn't remember, but he felt it. He felt safe. Tears came, not in sobs, but in silence. They rolled down without effort, without resistance. The body remembering what the mind had buried. Elliot said nothing, just watched the machine do what it was always meant to do. Not heal, not erase, but remind. Remind us that inside all the noise we carry, there is still a room untouched, a place where we are whole, unnamed, unjudged, just beings made of breath and memory. When the boy stood to leave, he looked at Elliot for the first time. "What is it?" he asked softly. Elliot smiled. "It's the sound dreams make when they return home." By the 16th night, something subtle had shifted in the town's rhythm. Shops began opening later. People spoke more slowly, listened more closely. Laughter came easier. Arguments faded before they began, as if the air itself had become too soft to hold tension. Even time seemed to bend. Afternoons lingering longer than usual, evenings arriving like a sigh instead of a shadow. And through it all, the clock continued its silent turning, like a moon caught in the center of the earth. Elliot started receiving letters, folded slips of paper left on the shop's step. No names, no requests, just stories. Fragments of dreams people didn't want to forget. I saw my father again. He was younger. He smiled. There was a staircase made of books, and I climbed it until I touched the stars. I think I forgave her. Finally. Elliot read each one and tucked them gently into a wooden drawer beside the machine, not to store them, but to feed them to the clock. Not literally, of course, but each story, each thread of emotion became part of the spiral, shaping its rhythm, its glow, its pulse. The machine was learning, not like a computer, but like a soul. It didn't need to know name or dates or logic. It only needed resonance, the truth underneath the words. That night, Elliot sat alone, holding one of the letters. It was written in a child's hand. I dreamed I could fly. I wasn't scared. I just went. He placed it on the spiral face of the clock, and for the first time, it pulsed. A soft wave of warmth flowed outward, brushing his fingers, his cheeks, the very air around him. The light brightened, just briefly, then dimmed again. And somewhere in the town, a child laughed in her sleep. Not because of the dream she had, but because something, someone, had caught it and was keeping it safe. On the 17th night, Elliot dreamt of clocks with no hands and oceans with no shore. He stood beneath a sky stitched from pages of forgotten journals. Stars blinked like blinking eyes, each one watching, waiting, remembering. And in the center of it all stood the spiral, not the machine in his shop, but a towering, living version of it, spinning slowly above the dream world like a second moon. When he woke, the spiral on the real clock was perfectly still, not broken, not paused, listening. That day, no one came to the shop. The streets outside were quiet, wrapped in that hush before a thunderstorm, though no clouds gathered. Elliot didn't move for hours. He just sat in front of the clock, waiting to understand what it already knew. And then, in the very center of the spiral, a light appeared, faint, gentle, blue like memory. It wasn't fire, not electricity. It was recognition. Elliot rose and approached, breath shallow, heart slow. As he neared, the light expanded, and for a fleeting second, he wasn't in the workshop anymore. He was back in her arms, the one he had built this for, the one who whispered in his dreams when the world got too loud, the one whose laughter he had bottled inside the gears and glass. She stood there, timeless, not older or younger, just present. She said nothing. She didn't need to. He stepped forward, reached out, and touched nothing, because it wasn't her. It was the feeling of her, the echo of every night they had laid in silence, the warmth of her hand in his when neither needed to speak. He fell to his knees, not in sadness, but in surrender. The machine had done it. It had pulled the thread of his deepest longing and shown him the shape it made. Not to torture, not to erase, but to give it back, so he could hold it one last time before letting it float into the space between sleep and forever. The 18th night brought with it a hush that extended beyond the town. The forest just beyond Elmsworth fell silent. No rustling of leaves, no chirping of crickets, no distant howl of foxes. Even the river slowed, not in current, but in sound, as though the entire world had leaned in to listen. Inside the shop, Elliot sat motionless. His eyes were open, but unfocused, as if still caught between that glimpse of her and the breathless ache it left behind. The spiral turned again, slowly, but something had changed. The center no longer glowed for him. It pulsed outward, reaching, as if casting invisible threads across the town, searching for another story to bring forward. Elliot realized it was no longer bound to the room. It had begun its descent into the deeper layers, not just of dreams, but of collective memory. That night, the clock reached someone who had never entered the shop. A woman bedridden for years. As she lay staring at the ceiling, something shifted. The shadows around her softened, and a breeze brushed her cheek, though the windows were closed. Then, without knowing why, she smiled and closed her eyes. She dreamed of her mother's garden, blooming wildly with roses that whispered lullabies. She was a child again, holding a basket too big for her arms, laughing as petals rained from nowhere. She had not spoken in months, but in her sleep she whispered, "Thank you." Across town, a newborn stirred in its crib, not crying, just watching, as if something ancient and kind had passed overhead like a cloud. The baby's eyes fluttered, then closed, a smile barely formed. The spiral turned once more in Elliot's shop. Its pulse grew stronger, its purpose clearer, not just to bring rest, but to carry dreams back to those who had lost them, forward to those who hadn't yet known them, and deep into the space where time forgets itself. The clock had become something else now, not an invention, but an invitation. By the 19th night, the town began to glow, not from street lamps or fireplaces, but from within the people themselves. Their eyes held more softness, their footsteps grew lighter. They began looking at each other a little longer, not searching, not judging, just recognizing, because something was happening they didn't know how to name, and somehow they didn't need to. The dreams were changing. They no longer belonged only to individuals. They began to weave. A teacher dreamed of a tree she used to sit under as a child, only to discover the next day that her student had dreamed of the same tree. A man dreamed of humming a lullaby, and his wife, asleep beside him, woke with that melody on her lips. Some started writing their dreams down. Others painted them. One little boy began building miniature spirals out of sticks in his backyard. When asked why, he simply said, "Because they remember me." In the shop, Elliot watched the spiral move slower and deeper. Its light now cycled in patterns, not just colors, but moods. Sepia for longing, violet for memory, emerald for childhood, deep navy for grief, softened by time. Each rotation of the clock pulled threads from across the town. Heartbeats, dreams, quiet wishes left unspoken, and wove them into something invisible but undeniably shared. And Elliot realized the machine was no longer just for sleep. It was becoming a mirror, not of faces, but of feeling. A place to remember what it meant to be human before the world asked us to forget. He began to hear whispers at night, not from the spiral, but from beyond it, familiar voices, strangers, children, elders, some speaking in languages he didn't know, but somehow understood, not asking for help, not asking to be saved, just telling their stories, because the clock had opened a door, not to dreams, but to the sacred space beneath them, where the soul finally exhales and says, "I'm still here." On the 20th night, the spiral no longer turned only in the shop. It turned within the people. It was a quiet revolution, the kind that didn't topple buildings or light fires, but shifted the ground beneath everything. People started sleeping not just deeper, but truer. Their dreams stopped being random fragments. They became maps, maps back to themselves. The mayor, a practical man known for tight schedules and tight smiles, dreamed of a cabin by a lake, one he'd never seen, yet knew in his bones. The florist dreamed of a greenhouse suspended in the sky, each bloom humming her mother's lullabies. And a deaf boy who'd never heard music dreamed he was playing a violin made of stars. When he woke, he signed to his parents, "I heard everything." In the shop, Elliot's spiral responded. It turned with quiet majesty, humming low, like a tide rising beneath the floorboards. He had stopped writing. The machine now wrote for him, not on paper, but in light. It flickered messages on the walls in spirals of gold and silver. Language without alphabet, emotion made visible. One phrase lingered longer than the others. When the world forgets how to feel, teach it to remember how to sleep. Elliot whispered it to himself, again and again, until it became a kind of mantra, a lullaby for the waking world. That night, he opened the door wide. No one came, but they didn't need to, because the clock was already inside them now. The hum lived in their breaths, their dreams, the stillness that wrapped around their shoulders like memory. They no longer needed to visit the spiral. The spiral had come to them, and as Elliot sat in the glow of the machine, eyes closed, hands resting on his knees, he realized something deeper than all his years of invention. He had not built the clock for others. He had built it for the moment when he too would need to be remembered. And the machine had not forgotten him. The 21st night brought thunder, not loud, not angry, but distant, like the echo of something once great and now returning. Elmsworth didn't flinch. The thunder was welcome. It sounded like old truths waking up. Elliot walked through the town at dusk, spiral light still on his fingertips. Wherever he stepped, the ground seemed softer. Children waved from porches. Elders sat outside without coats, faces turned to the sky, waiting, not for rain, but for remembering. He passed the library and felt something pulse. Inside, people sat at tables, not reading books, but writing in blank journals. Writing dreams, writing what they remembered from the spiral. Some pages were filled with nothing but shapes, others with names long forgotten. One child had written over and over, "I saw him. He wasn't gone." Elliot wept as he walked, not from sorrow, but from overwhelm, the gentle kind that arrives when something long awaited finally appears and says nothing, only smiles. Back in the shop, the clock spun more slowly now. Each rotation seemed to stretch across minutes, maybe hours. It no longer marked time. It shaped it. Visitors came less often, but when they did, they stayed longer, sometimes silent for hours, sitting in the golden glow, remembering things they never lived, but somehow felt. A man who had never known his father dreamed of a figure standing at the edge of a field, waving. No face, just presence, and the warmth of being wanted. A woman whose memory was fading to illness wept because, in front of the spiral, she remembered the name of her sister. Just her name. But it was enough. Elliot lit no lamps anymore. The clock lit everything now. And in its reflection, he saw not just light, but motion, waves, threads, possibilities stretching far beyond the borders of Elmsworth, because the dream had begun to travel, and it would stop until the world remembered. That sleep was not surrender. It was sanctuary. Now the machine spins without Elliot. It spins in silence, in song, in soft, golden truth. The town of Elmsworth no longer needs to explain its peace. People arrive in the middle of the night, drawn not by signs, but by whispers. They sit before the spiral. Some cry, some smile, some leave a piece of themselves behind, a sigh, a name, a forgotten lullaby. And the machine accepts them all, because sleep is not the absence of thought. It's the place where thought becomes feeling again. And in that place, we meet the ones we've lost. We meet the ones we've yet to become. We meet ourselves. The spiral turns, slower now, deeper now. It doesn't measure time. It remembers it. One rotation for every dream left unfinished. One hum for every child still afraid of the dark. One pulse for every soul waiting to be told, "You're safe now. Close your eyes. I'll hold the rest." And somewhere, perhaps right now, as you lie in bed, listening to the hush beneath your heartbeat, you may feel it too. The spiral, turning, calling, welcoming you home. If you're still here, still drifting in that quiet space between memory and dream, then let the spiral stay with you, spinning softly behind your eyelids, carrying you deeper, gently, peacefully. You don't need to do anything now. Just breathe and rest. But if this story held you, if it helped you remember something you'd forgotten, or feel something you didn't know you needed, then stay with us. Subscribe to Whispers of Sleep for more journeys like this, where truth wears the shape of dreams. And every night, becomes a return to the quiet place inside you. Until next time, sleep well, dream deep, and know you are never alone in the spiral. Good night.